Welcome to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the authors that bring them to you. Before we get started, let's go around the room, have everyone introduce themselves, a little bit about who you are, and mentioning the book that you're going to talk about tonight. And we'll start with you, Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela Giddings. I'm actually a molecular biologist by training, and I write kind of futuristic fantasy horror. And the current series I'm working, which is Dance of Ages, I'm going to be talking about the second book in that series called The Shower of Embers.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right, Lisa.
Hi, my name is Alma Wood. I'm a psychological horror author. This book I'm going to talk about tonight is actually my second novel. It's being re-released. It's called The Promise Keeper, and it is a vampire tale.
All right, Stuart.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stuart Jaffe. I'm the author of numerous series, almost 50 books now. Best known for the Max Porter Paranormal Mysteries, which the 14th one just came out, and that's what I'll be talking about.
All right, Frank.
I'm Frank W. Butterfield, and I'm the author of several series. I write gay romance and gay mystery, adventure and thriller. I'm just came out with book number 78, I think. And we'll be talking about the fifth book in my series that's set here in 1948 Daytona Beach, called The Biker Who Got Bumped Off.
All right, perfect. And finally, Alma.
Hi, first of all, you're a molecular biologist, so am I, by training. And all I'll say on that matter is that you really ought to read my Weir Chronicles. You really ought to. But the book that I'm talking about today is my newest release, which dropped only a couple of days ago, about a week ago, called Fractured Fairy Tales, which is a collection of stories, some of which are pure fairy tales that you've never heard before, which originated in here, some of which are retellings of things you will recognize, but we've never seen in that kind of guise before. And some of them are fairy tale-like objects, which have the atmosphere of the fairy tale, but you wouldn't necessarily have picked out of a lineup if you were lined up with the usual suspects. So I think that it's a good mix, and I think and I managed to get a cover by James Artemis Owen, which is absolutely out of this world. So the whole package is amazing. So I'm just really, very pleased with this book.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and jump into your release. And I'll start with you, Elmarie. Tell us something about the idea behind this book or the series.
Well, this one's actually a standalone. I didn't do a whole lot of series work. I've just started, that's new for me. I don't know, with horror, I don't see it as often, but it's something I'm diving into. But again, The Promise Keeper is a standalone book, and it's about a vampire. And, I write psychological horror, so it was kind of hard to pull away from that and write something more traditional. But what I did was I used my psychological horror background and used a more traditional antagonist, and that was really, really fun. The book starts off in West Africa, and then you follow once she turns into a vampire, you follow her through the Caribbean, through the United States, and she lands basically in New York. And it's space and time, if you will. So she's not only in all those different locations, but it's different centuries she's ending up in there. So there was quite a bit of research required to get that, some of the details down. It's not a historical fiction novel, so I'm not, mired in those details, but it's nice to have some of the true, factual data so that you can set the scene and actually make it feel real. But yeah, it was a lot of fun because it's different from what I've done in the past. It's just a change in terms of what the motivations that my vampire was having. I don't normally write vampire fiction, so that motivation was completely different. And I think I approached it from that standpoint where she's really a reluctant vampire. This was not something she was wanting or into at all. She's actually never into it. So from that perspective, at least I was able to put in some of what I do all the time, what I do naturally in that psychological horror headspace of, what's going on here? Why is this happening to me? And holy cow, how do I work this? and still keep the vampire angle, because I mean she has to do that because obviously she has to participate in that lifestyle, because if she's going to succeed or exist, she has to do so. So it was a lot of fun to write.
The time periods you said, are they all in the past or?
No, you go from the 1800s to current day.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Stuart, how about you?
So the 14th book is called Southern Graves. Every book in the series is Southern something. And basically the series itself is follows this guy, Max Porter. He moves down to North Carolina and discovers his office is haunted by the ghost of a 1940s detective. So he does what anyone in that situation would do and starts a detective agency with the ghost. And as you do. And I take real history of the triad, which is where I live, and mix it with witches, ghosts, and curses and magic. So that's the general premise of the series. And each book that I write in it, usually there's anywhere from a couple weeks to a month or so of research of trying to find unique, odd bits of history that have enough gaps that I can insert fiction into it and play with it. And then I usually build a mystery out of that, and then there are overarching character development that continues book to book. I also have a running list of titles, Southern this, Southern that I can pull from for inspiration or for whatever. And so I had the title Southern Graves for a long time, and I'm like, well, and I had no idea what I was going to write this book about. So I thought, okay, let's start the research. It's going to be a month of research and figure it out. And so I put in, I literally Googled graveyards in North Carolina. And the first thing that comes up is Graveyard Island. And I looked at it and I went, no way, it can't be that easy. And sure enough, it became that easy. And that led to one thing after another, and the whole mystery built itself around that. I've never had such an easy time doing research. As for the characters, the story, I mean, the mystery, of course, is a mystery, so I'm not going to spoil that. Other than you now know, it takes a big part of it takes place in Graveyard Island. The other big graveyard that came up in my research that also became a component of the mystery was Salisbury National Cemetery, which if you've ever heard of Andersonville from the Civil War, is a famous Georgian prison camp that was atrocious and horrible conditions. And apparently there was more than one and of those situations, and one of them was here in North Carolina at Salisbury Prison. And so those two elements bound together to make the mystery of the story. And then the one of the big themes of the series overall is family and found family. And Max and his wife and their ghost partner, Marshall Drummond, the three of them have been together since the beginning. Over time, Max's mother moved down and she's become a part of the family. And then they adopted two boys who were homeless, and they're called, one of them's named PB and the other is Jay. So they're the Sandwich Boys. And all together, they now this family. And so for the last bunch of books, I've been exploring different parts of that. And this one, the boys are now teenagers, and this one really explores Jay and his trying to find where he fits in the family and how he wants to get involved in the family business of investigating these things, and so he gets much too involved for as the thing that instigates the whole entire book is that a ghost has tethered itself to Jay, and they kind of want to stop that. So I think that kind of encompasses the setup, at least for y'all.
Right. Now, do you think you're going to run out of Southern titles first or mysteries first? You got plenty?
Neither. First, I've discovered that, well, this is probably true of every state, but North Carolina has so many weird little stories in it. I keep thinking there's no way I'm going to find anything else. And then graveyard. I've lived here for over 20 some years, and I never heard of this place. And I mean, it's this island that's inaccessible. There's no roads to it. I mean, it's a long story of how it got made, but it's basic. The short of it is that there was an area that was purposely flooded for a dam, and the town that was underneath it, they moved all the graves and created this island, but they didn't actually like make a graveyard up. They just kind of dumped. So there's no order. It's not like orderly rows of headstones. They're just headstones in the woods. It's creepy as anything. The only way to get there is either by boat or an old train line that used to go through there that you'd have to walk on for a couple miles to get to. It's just, I mean, there's so many weird things like that in this state. And as far as Southern titles go, I worried about that for a while, and then I realized that you can pretty much put anything after Southern and it sounds like you need it to sound, as long as it ties in with the whatever the book's about.
All right, perfect. So Frank, what about your book?
My book is The Biker Who Got Bumped Off. It's the 5th in a series of books set here, because I live in Daytona Beach. Here in Daytona Beach in the late 40s. I like to call it Perry Mason by the Beach, because it's about an attorney, Tom, and his lover, Ronnie, who's his private investigator, and then kind of a group of people that work with them. And in this particular book, it's set right around the Daytona 200 in 1948, which is now generally called Bike Week, but then it would have been like Bike Weekend, because it didn't go on for a whole week. And there's a murder at a motel kind of on the beach, and there's a couple of different bike gangs that are involved, and Tom and Ronnie have to basically figure out who did it, because they know that the police have the wrong suspect and they've misidentified the body. So there's a lot of trying to figure all that out, and trying to figure out also how to get things into the trial without revealing the nature of all the relationships. That's a really big part of the story. Trying to actually defend, they've got a gay defendant, and trying to defend him without being able to talk about a lot of things that would otherwise put them in jeopardy of being charged with sodomy. So that's a really, I didn't realize it'd be quite that complicated, but this book took 2 years for me to write, which is about 20 times longer than any book ever takes. I did a tremendous amount of research, because I had to basically construct the Florida, Volusia County, which is the county that I live in, how trials were held, because there's literally no transcripts that I've ever been able to find of any trial set in that time. And Florida had a major change in their legal system in the 70s. So there's some things that are still the same, some little teeny tiny things that are the same that are interesting that aren't found anywhere else. Like we have six member juries for everything but capital punishment, which I didn't even know myself until I got into this. But the really fascinating thing about doing this book was I had to basically go find another trial, a real murder, and that was documented in the newspapers. Because fortunately, I have access to all the papers, which is itself a major event. And so I actually documented a trial that happened the summer before this trial would have occurred. And it was a very convoluted trial that revealed a couple of things that I didn't know about, which was, one was this real life trial was the instance where it was the first time there was ever any Black members of a grand jury or even of a jury itself in this county. And the way that happened is itself its own story. And at some point I may end up writing a nonfiction about this particular event, because nobody knows about it. But it was a very significant thing that happened. But anyway, so constructing the trial, I went literally through every single step. Everything that could go wrong in that real life trial went wrong. So I have a tremendous amount of documentation about how to do things. And that was really helpful. I basically use that as the guide for this book, and I'm going to use it as a guide for all my future books in this series, because that's one of the things I knew I didn't have enough of, was just a basic understanding that Florida is a different state than California. And if you want to write his mid-century California trials, it's easy because you've got Perry Mason and all of that stuff is accurate because Earl Stanley Gardner was a lawyer. And so you can watch a TV show and you can actually see how the trials worked. But it was a great story to write. It was a great, I really, really, really enjoyed writing about basically these guys who were veterans who bought a Harley and were traveling all over the country and ended up here, and kind of the precursor to what became things like the Hells Angels and biker groups like that. So that was a lot of fun. The one last thing about this story that I really, really enjoyed was the fact that I got to look into, this series is different than the other series that I write because it's got 5 POVs that jump about. Normally I write a first person narrator, but this one we get to see through 5 different characters. And watching one of the characters, who's kind of the youngest in the group, begin to become an adult, because he's like 20 or he's 19, I think, and he's had a really tough life. And he's really just kind of coming into his own. And that's part of what this story is about, is how he does that. So it's a great story, and I really, really loved it. And I'm so glad I'm finished. I cannot say that enough. But it was a lot of fun. It was a real labor of love, that's for sure.
All right, perfect. Alma.
I'm here with my fairy tale book, and I'm not exactly sure how this idea actually coalesced or came about. I mean, I kind of just came up with a collection of fairy tale like objects that kind of just came together. It was like a little bit of a little snowball coming down a mountain, and then it just gathered speed and momentum, and before I knew it, we were at the bottom of the mountain. It was an avalanche, and I didn't quite know what happened. But what started this whole direction off many years ago, the first book I ever got published, was a collection of 3 little fairy tales. And when I was first notified of that by a British agent who picked it up and sold it to Longman as a kind of an educational publisher type of thing, and she kept on telling me your book, and I kept on hearing your stories in a book, and she was going, no, your book, your book, yourself, your little. It took her about 5 times before she got that through my thick skull, that yes, this was my book, my 3 stories, nobody else, just me. So that was the first thing that I ever had published, and that thing went through 9 printings. It gave me royalties, trickles of royalties for well over a decade after it was published. It's kind of out of print now, but for 10 years, Longman is an educational thing that was used in the classroom. So for 10 years plus, there was a generation of British school children who hated me because at the end of the book was the usual set of questions. What did the author mean by this? And the author just wrote a fairy tale, but they had to go and figure out what my subconscious was trying to tell them. Good luck to you, but it's not my fault. But that was the first book that I ever had published, those 3 fairy tales. And that's just the way my mind works. I just go into these fantasy worlds and just drown in them and come up with stories. And I kind of went on to become a prolific novelist. I mean, okay, you guys have got 50 books and 70 books, and I'm sorry, but I've only got 20 odd. But that's quite a thing. And basically, I've been doing this full time for just over 20 years. So that works out to about a book a year, which is not bad going. But when I came to collect these stories for this particular book, there was all kinds of things that just came up and said, look, I need to be in here. And there's a bunch of stuff. I included the original 3 stories there in here. They're reprinted in here. There was an anthology that I edited a couple of years ago now called Children of a Different Sky, which was a response to the travel ban on foreigners that was instituted a little while ago by an ex-president whom we shall not speak of. And there was, that just sharpened my focus on the fact that the refugee problem has always been with us, except that we didn't really know about it. Now it's televised. Now you've got people who are drowning in rivers on television. Now you've got people who are being shot on borders on television. Now you've got people who are running from hot wars on television. And it's in your mind's eye more than anything ever. So this was in my head when I did this collection of the anthology story. The anthology was about refugees and often by people who had some kind of connection to that. And the proceeds were going to refugee charities. That was the idea. It was a charity anthology. So I had refugees on my mind. And at one point I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I was on my husband's computer, which was upstairs next door to the bedroom. My office is downstairs a little bit further away, but I needed a computer now because there was a story in my head that wouldn't let go. And I was just typing at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not a morning person, trust me. I was up there because this story was knocking insistently on the shutters of my brain until I opened them and wouldn't let me sleep. So I was writing the story, and that gave birth to 4 stories, which were essentially a take on what would happen if the Disney princesses that you all know so well were refugees. So I've got stories about Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and the Little Mermaid. And oh boy, these are not the stories that your children have learned. It was a hard thing to get your head around because it was so easy to put them there. It was unbelievable. I mean, the situation, but but for the grace of God go I kind of thing was just brought home so hard when I was writing those stories, and they are real, but they are fairy tales like you wouldn't believe. I mean, they just, like I said somewhere in the introduction to this thing, all the best fairy tales are true. And this book is a kind of witness to that. There's a lot of stories in here which are, focused on a fairy tale like image, but the underlying truth of it is sometimes a very bitter pill. One of the stories that I wrote for this book, brand new, never seen before except here, was a retelling, and it was a retelling of The Little Match Girl, which is a bad enough tearjerker when you know about the original one, except I put this one into the children's compounds on the border where the kids were being held without their families. And my little match girl was lost in that throng. So, it's put a situation on the drawing board and superimpose a fairy tale on it. And there's a reality underneath that fairy tale that just jumps at you. It's all the best fairy tales are true.
Thank you. Angela, what about the idea for yours?
Well, the series, the Dance of Ages series, is set in a world that I created, and it's a world that's constantly being bombarded, most of the world, with these energy storms that kill 99% of the people that are caught out in them and mutate the 1% that survive. And the mutations come and you get shifters, shapeshifters, vampires, people that can wield the energy, telepaths, and that have been born out of these storms. There's one area on the world that's called the Backbone that's been kind of insulated from the storms, and they're basically normal humans were able to thrive, but there's always back and forth between the dangerous area and the safe area. And my character was born 5,000 years before the story started, and she was caught out in a storm and became an empath. And then a vampire came, found her, and turned her. So she's got 2 very different impulses in her head, the one to kind of protect and help and heal, and the other to, tackle, kill, rend, and control. So they're balanced in her for right now, but for many, many years, she was trapped by the vampire that turned her until he pissed off the wrong people, and an airstrike turned his castle into rubble, burying him underneath it. She was out and escaped because she's only a hybrid. She's a hybrid vampire empath. She could be out during the day. So she wasn't there when the castle got turned to rubble. eventually she found this teacher who taught her, instead of her normal way of dealing with it, every time she'd escaped him would be just to run. And every time he'd track her down, grab her, pull her back. This time she found somebody that taught her how to fight back. And the first book in the series is her taking that teachings and joining a group of people called the Guild of Problem Solvers that are, you know, most people call them assassins, but they do other rescue missions, you know, and other things in the Outlands. Like if you were somebody that needed escorting through the Outlands, they'd try to get you through them as safely, although there's no guarantees. Because if you run into the storm at the wrong time, there's nothing you can do about that. So the first book, she joined the guild and got into and started taking these missions and getting more confident in herself and her abilities. And in her mind, she created a kind of firewall, you know, between her old life and her new life, or a fire break. And the reason I named the second book A Shower of Embers is in a wildfire situation. There are these showers of embers that carry the wildfire over fire breaks. So this is, everything she's built is now at risk because her mentor is dying because he was old, and his gift, he was a seer. And in my world, seers basically see probabilities, and they can see hundreds and hundreds of probabilities, but eventually their minds break down and they can't stop seeing the probabilities. So they just, it's kind of in my mind a metaphor for dementia, which is something that, you know, with horror, and I've heard in the past, you know, write about things that scare you. That's something that you know, gets under my skin. So, you know, I wanted to address that with him. But also, she wasn't the only one that escaped that airstrike, because the vampire that turned her had another vampire that he had turned that was a hybrid that could go out during the day. And he also escaped. And that vampire is usually the one that would find her and drag her back for their boss. So this is her trying to hold him off and keep from being dragged back in this one.
All right, thank you. So my next question, I will start with you, Stuart. Something that you found surprising about being a published author?
Somebody would pay me money to do this. That still surprises me every day. I mean, I say that half sarcastically. It's such a privilege to be a writer. That, you know, that especially, I've been doing this a long time, and when I originally started out, this before the days that self-publishing was viable. So, you know, you had to, I wrote short stories forever, got an agent, the whole normal route. And I can remember just being happy at the end of the year to be able to take my wife to the movies. And that you know, off of a couple short story sales, and be like, woo, you know, we did that. And then, you know, as time progressed, and suddenly you're able to pay a bill or two bills, you know, once in a while. And then suddenly I'm paying my mortgage every month. And then, you know, you're putting food on the table and you're making a living doing it. And it's an amazing, I mean, that's, I go back and I can think of that time when just about every author I've ever met, every artist I've ever met has this thought where they're like, I don't care if I make it. I don't care if as long as I get one person out there, right? If one person reads my book, hears my song, and it changes their life, then that will be enough. And it's weird because it's true, but as artists, we're very good at constantly moving the finish line, and so we get that moment. You know, I've had people come up to me and tell me that my little story that I really thought was just, you know, a silly little thing changed their life for whatever reasons. And so then you know, you just keep wanting, mean, it's not that you want more and more. It's just, it's amazing that you can have this life, that people will pay you to do this, and to that they're affected by it in a good way. So I don't know if that was more than you wanted, but that's what came out.
Exactly. That's what I wanted. Frank, any thoughts from you on something you found surprising once you got behind the curtain?
There are a couple of things, actually. The one thing that surprised me the most was that people would email me out of nowhere. I mean, I do have a website. You can contact me. It's not like I was surprised, like, how did they find me? It just was that they would take the time to do so. That was really surprising. As a result of that, I began to realize that in my primary series, which is also set a little bit later than this Daytona Beach series, that I was actually writing about a lot of people's parents, their parents' generation. So most of my characters would be considered Greatest Generation. And so I was getting a lot of emails from people who would be the children of those folks, who would say, like, this reminds me of my parents, and this reminds me of this, and this, like, I remember them talking about this or this happening, which was very surprising. I didn't realize that I was going to be affecting people in that way. That was just off the wall. Part of what I do in my writing is that I'm offering kind of an alternate possibility of what could happen, particularly in my primary series, if there was someone who was outed long before such a thing was ever discussed or known. So the first person who's really outed in the United States was Harvey Milk, and he outed himself. But these guys get outed about 25 years before that. And they're wealthy enough that it doesn't affect them really, but it does affect them. And so I'm trying to, like, write a story, a universe where there's this group of people who basically were able to go through the 50s and 60s and 70s pretty much unscathed, and what that would do to them, and also how it would affect the other historical people who are right there with them. And that's, so investigating that and digging into that and becoming more, as much as I thought I knew about gay history and how we got to this point, the more I write, the more I realize how little I know, because it's just, the deeper I go, the more there is to explore and discover. So that's been amazing. And then one final thing I'll say is that I'm not quite sure how it happened, but well, I do know how it happened, but coincidentally, the police chief of Daytona Beach moved in downstairs because he started dating the woman who lives below me. And he's now the ex-chief, but because I write books that involve police procedural stuff, both contemporary here in Daytona Beach, but also the historical, he really plugged me into all these different people here in town who would answer questions for me about basically police stuff. And that has been, I just don't know how to describe it. I think one of the things that's been very helpful is it's humanized something that I felt very distant from as a gay man, always kind of afraid of the police for lots of reasons. And also his, just everything that's going on right now, but also everything that I've seen in my lifetime. But it's humanized. I mean, I've met some really lousy guys and gals who were not very nice and who would give me information that I wanted, but weren't particularly nice people. But I've also met some amazingly wonderful people so it kind of like gave me a depth, and this is not at all what I was expecting or what I thought would ever happen, into how, at least here in this city, how policing works and what the different elements of it are, and what that actually means in the present time. So that's been fascinating. And none of this would have happened if I wasn't writing. None of it. So it's very cool.
Alma.
Well, two things come to mind. The first one is that question of, often crops up, and I'm sure all of you have heard it at least once in an interview somewhere along the line, was, when did you know you wanted to be a writer? And to me, that is a nonsensical question, because I never knew I wanted to be a writer. I was one. I was born telling stories, and that's what I did all of my life. Before I knew how to write them down, I told lies. It's a kind of thing it's instinctive. It's not something that I wanted to do. It's not like you wanted to be a doctor and then you go and study to be a doctor. There's no course of study to be a writer. You don't want to be a writer and then you go and get a PhD in writing a novel. There's no such thing. Well, there's MFAs, but that's a different beast altogether. But it's not the kind of thing you can go out and get training for to become. You are or you are not. And some people might tune into it later in life, which is fine. But they didn't know that they wanted to be a writer when they turned 50. They just woke up to the fact that they were one, and there was a story that needed to be said. That kind of thing. You don't go through life saying, "Well, I want to be a writer today." It just seems like foreign to my way of thinking. And the other is, like I said, all the best fairy tales are true, and all the best stories are true in one sense. And the emotional truth behind something that it was born in your head, in your heart, and it gets tossed out there, and then you get a response from these complete strangers that blows you away, who read this, who understood far more than you thought you could possibly have put into it. I mean, there was one signing that I did for my Secrets of Jinshay novel many years ago, which was the historical fantasy that was rooted in Imperial China. And I was doing a signing for this thing in a bookstore, and this woman comes along to me and she hands me this book and she asked me to sign it for her Chinese adopted daughter. And I was very happy about this, and I asked for the spelling, and it was all very nice. And I wrote down to this girl, and I wrote her name, and I wrote the book. And the woman says, "I'm going to give it to her to read when she's old enough." And I kind of lifted my head and go, "Oh, old enough? How old is she now?" "She's 3. I just about started crying because this woman thought this book was valuable enough to get it signed as an heirloom for her 3-year-old to be given it when she was 15 or 16 years old. It just blew me off the planet. The rest of the signing, I don't even remember. I just remember sitting there going, "Oh my God." And that happens. It doesn't happen often. When it does happen, it's a mind-blowing thing. It's a moment of magic, and it's the biggest reward that you get for doing this, to connect with a reader like that.
Angela.
I think, I'm fairly new at this. This is my second novel for that, but one thing I was very surprised at with the first one is somebody in Luxembourg bought my book. Going, awesome! It brightened my whole week, and I just love sharing this because I've been writing stories for myself since I was in middle school, and on the long half-hour bus rides home, I'd sit there and write in my notebook and write these stories, and a few years ago, I just decided, well, let's try it and share it. And for the people I've bought it, I've had really, really positive feedback on it, and it's just amazing to share it. And it's definitely a really, really good feeling. And I just enjoy the creative outlet, and I probably would do it even if I wasn't, selling it to anybody, but this, publishing it allows me to share it with people that I haven't ever met before, and as well as I before the late unpleasantness, I would go to this restaurant for lunch, and the guy that owned the restaurant said, "Oh, you're a writer," and got my book and read it, and just was very, very, it's like. And then one of the other waiters is like, "So how do you write a novel?" And I'm going, "I'm very new at this. My suggestion is just write, come up with your idea and make it, and just write it and see where it goes."
All right,
So.
Perfect. And I'm sorry to give you the hardest spot here, Elmarie, since there have been so many great answers.
Yeah, and I am going to echo some of that. I mean, I think that we're all pretty much feeling the same way, in that something that we wrote impacted someone else enough for them to either talk to us about it or tell someone else about it. And all this stuff just came out of our heads. We're sitting in our room typing and doing what we're doing, and someone else is actually consuming this information and being moved by it in some way. I mean, from the horror writer's perspective, I've always wanted to scare someone with my work. And I had that mindset of, as long as I can scare one person, I should be satisfied. And when I years ago, this is so long ago, but I don't do a lot of conventions. I'm just sort of starting to ramp up with that. But I did a convention years ago, and I mean, I'm saying years ago, like years ago, did a convention, and it was my first novel, and I was doing this panel, and I think this is great. It'd be like 4 of us here, and come to find out, I didn't read it real. I don't know. I thought it said panel, but it was more like presentation, so it was just me, and I'm like, really? Okay, I'll be ready. I can do this, and I did it. And it was standing room only, which is really intimidating in the first place, because I kept thinking, do they think they're supposed to be somewhere else? But they didn't, because when it was over, they come up to talk with me, and I'm thinking, no one's gonna come to me, and I'm packing up my stuff. People come up and they've got my book, like you can see the spine is bent because they've been opening and it's curled, and they've got notes, like, because psychological horror, people just really like to dive into this. So there's notes, and I'm like, which is also pretty intimidating the first time you see it, because you're like, I don't know if I know the answer. But they're waiting to talk to me about this novel that I wrote. And I'm the first couple of people, I was like, are you kidding me? And they're like, no, this was so good. And I read it the third time. I'm like, no, not my book, really? It's a feeling that is unlike anything else. I'll be honest, I thought I'd be happy to make some sales and that would be cool, but then I said, okay, someone will, like Stuart was saying, we up the ante a little. Well, if I can scare somebody, great. I didn't know how I'd react to a room that was completely full. And when at the end, people want me to sign this curled up book that they have been reading and reading and rereading. I just was stunned. That does not get old, at least for me. I am still fully surprised by that. So fast forward, I took a big break. I mean, I started out in the early 2000s. I took a break to start my family because I figured, because as writers, we can just put our heads down and not look up. And next thing you know, so I wanted to have kids, so I did. So, start my family. I came back on after, they were old enough for me to feel comfortable to pull away to do the writing we need to do every now and then, right? Sometimes motivation comes midday and you can't stop it. So when I came back, I thought this is gonna be like starting over. This is gonna be horrible. Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't do anything for 8 years or some silly time frame. No, people were like, oh, Elle Marie Wood. I'm like, what? Wait a minute. Do you know who I am? Like you think you're mistaken though. You're thinking about somebody else from high school or something. And it wasn't. They actually remembered my writing. And I mean, at the time when I started out, I had a lot of short stories out. I had 2 short story collections out, indeed. A whole bunch of them placed in print and online and all this. And then I had the 2 novels. And I just kept thinking, no way anybody remembers that. But they did. So it's not, and that's not what surprises me about that is that something that I created in my own imagination stuck, so that someone else would come back when I decide I'm ready to write again and say, when are you going to put out whatever it is, which is it's phenomenal. So it doesn't get old. The second part that I wanted to add into about what surprises me is the fact that I can still come up with stuff. I mean, I've been writing since I was 5, just like Alma said, I didn't decide to do it. It's just something that I've done because it's what I do best. It's what I've always done. So it just kind of happened, I followed along and said, this, okay, obviously there's a career in this, so I better go after it because this is what I'm going to do. And that I can still come up with something creepy. It's kind of exciting when you think that so much of the creepy stuff has been done, but no, us psychological horror authors have a whole different twist on stuff. So it's awesome to me that I can still create something, hand it to my beta, and one of my betas reads I don't think sometimes I quiz her because I'm like, you didn't read that. You got done in 2 minutes. You couldn't have finished it. she did. She understands it, and she's always like, "Why is this so scary?" I'm like, "God, you know who you're reading? I mean, I don't know, 10 years. Come on, you know, like you've been reading me for 10 years." But she can still come up with that, and I'm just amazed that I can still write that. So I think that, you know, I'm kind of walking around in this mode of just being so incredibly thankful that something I've written down actually did scare somebody. People actually cared enough to read it, and I can still write it. So yeah, you ask about what surprises me. I think quite a bit.
All right, perfect. So my next question, I'll jump over to you, Frank. Going back to the story we're talking about, what do you hope people get out of it?
Oh, you know, I never think of that. I really have never really think in those terms, because I just think about the story that I want to read. That's the one that I write. So I don't know. Well, I mean, on a certain level, I hope that they'll get the awareness of what it was like to live here then, in all of its different varieties and mutations. Because that's one of the things I do love about writing historical fiction, is because I like to write it as though I'm reading as though I'm writing it contemporaneously. So I don't do a lot. I mean, I do some explanation, but I don't do a lot of explanation. I just assume that the reader is also reading in 1948, and so they'll get some of the references. And that's part of the way I think that I'm able to pull people into the past so that they can walk around and look at it. But I also, there's this really, it was unexpected. I wasn't planning it. It just popped up. There's a love story in this novel that it's the beginning of something. It's like I was saying, the youngest character, his name is Howie. He falls in love with these two guys, and they can't quite figure out what to call it because it's 1948. And he's just kind of like, I don't know what this is, but I know that it feels right. And there's just some real sweetness to that. And that, if nothing else, I think there's the trial and all this great legal stuff, but the sweetness of that story is probably one of my favorite parts of the book. So I really hope that people enjoy that as much as anything.
All right, thank you. Alma.
Well, in terms of fairy tales, like I said, all the fairy tales are true. What really jumps out at me when it comes to that kind of subgenre is it's been attributed to a lot of people, but I think it was J.K. Chesterton who said it first, that the power of the fairy tales is not by telling us that there are dragons, but the dragons can be defeated. And fairy tales happen to all of us, really, every day. We live them, we just don't realize that we do. And I suppose one of the best things that can happen is for someone to pick up a story collection like this and pick up a story, any story, and just start recognizing something that was or is reality to them. It doesn't matter if the story is about a couple of witches who are trying to raise a child together because they were both promised the firstborn child of this particular couple. One of them was promised by the wife and the other one was promised by the husband. Now they both turn up and they want to claim the kid, and they had to have Baba Yaga come and mediate. So this is the kind of shattered family situation that you get, every day out there, really. There the stories like that are 100 of them. If you crack open any newspaper, you're going to find displaced kids and made families that kind of congealed out of remnants of other families that have to figure out how to live with each other. And that's a fairy tale in the making. In a way, I was primed for this because my grandmother lived one of those fairy tale existences when she was very young. When she was maybe, I don't know, a handful of years old, and her mother died in childbirth with the second child in the family, and the baby died too, and she was left an orphan little girl with her father, who then remarried the stepmother from the fairy tales. She was bullied, she was Cinderellaed into being the scullery maid in the house. She was sleeping behind I'm exaggerating, but she was sleeping behind the stove in the ashes kind of thing, especially when the stepmother then gave birth to the son. and the sun and the air then took over everything. And when my grandmother was 18, she escaped from that hell into marriage to my grandfather, who is a lovely man, but he was a product of his time. He was completely patriarchal, and she was subjected to his whims and wills the rest of her life. But that's a fairy tale. And I was brought up on that as a family background, and fairy tales are real. They happen to people. They happened to my own grandmother. I was married for 20 years to a very good man who died a couple of months ago. That was a fairy tale that happened to me.
Thank you.
Wow.
Angela, what do you hope people pull away from the Dance of Ages book?
I'm hoping that they get pulled in and start, really caring for the main character specifically, but some of the others as well, and get wrapped up in the story. Honestly, it's an action adventure. For this, it's like, I always love the loner character, kind of like the vampire hunter D, Witcher, that character, but they're all boys. So in this one, I try with Almira, I tried to create one of those from a female perspective. And yes, she's got the empathy in that, but she uses it as a weapon, because the vampire part of her is very predatory, and that but I'm really hoping that people just get pulled into the story and read it and can't put it down.
All right. Marie, other than scaring people?
Well, that was my first answer, Jason.
I have to take the easy ones away.
Now, I think that, that would have been my first answer and my only answer maybe years ago when it was originally released. But now on this re-release, and with the climate, and I'm not speaking of the current unpleasantness. There's much discussion now about the stories that are being told about or by African American people. And some of the terms I just don't like the wording, but I'll say racial horror. There's another term that we've all probably heard that I just thought it's a little crass, and I'm not going to say it in this discussion, but racial horror it's relatively new. Like, as a person who doesn't look at my fiction and my either watching or reading from a political standpoint, I don't do the whole social context thing. I get it, I see it, but I ignore it because I'm interested in the baddie. I want to see the nasty thing that's happening and not think about consumerism or some other whatever. I'm not interested in that usually. But as an African American horror author, and I've always been that, there are not a lot that claim this genre, and even far less that claim psychological horror, but just not a lot. And in that vein, psychological horror is quiet, right? So it's not that you have blood, but it's not like the main focus, right? I mean, there's a lot of other things we focus on in my subgenre, and it's not necessarily racial horror. Like, I don't think about that necessarily. There's been a lot of talk recently, and some of these shows that we've been binging during the current unpleasantness, as we all have. You've seen some of it being brought out to play. And I think that there's two different camps, one that says, oh, tell the story because the story needs to be told, and the other camp that says there are a million other stories. We don't need to keep telling that same story. And I hope I'm speaking in a way that, I hope I'm being clear about what I'm saying. The struggling portion of the history that is true, absolutely true, as part of African Americans' history and the part of America's history, is not the only story that African Americans can tell. It's not the only story that we have. It's, not the only thing that we are interested in. So from my perspective, this novel has a Black protagonist, which usually my novels are, you're gonna get, you can pick, I'm describing what I want to describe, and their racial makeup is not necessarily what's being described there. That's not the point of, but in this one, I started the story in Africa, and we moved on from, and that was quite deliberate. It was necessary for the story, but at the same time, it's not necessarily about any sort of struggle whatsoever about except vampirism. There is a vampire that she does not down with it. She does not want to be a vampire. And that is where the story lies. So my hope is that when people read this story, they say, oh, there's something else. I mean, this is something different. It's not about what, it's not heavy and weighty and loaded with, I don't know, the racial horror. I don't know. I'm still warming up to that term, but it's not loaded with that. This is just a vampire tale with a Black protagonist, and that brings different things to the table. But as would a Japanese protagonist, as would a Latino protagonist. All of it changes depending upon the perspective. So, and I would not have said that when it came out initially. Now, but the climate is different, a little bit different now, and I think that it's this is absolutely representative of something else. And I'd like for people to see it as such and understand, if they didn't understand that there are other stories to be told, which I think that's nonsense too. I think most people recognize that the struggle is only a portion. A lot of other people know that there's other stuff that make up a history, but this is definitely representative of something different. So I'm hoping that people can see that.
All right, perfect. Stuart.
Well, I guess there's two levels to what I want people to get out of it. I always, as I'm sure everybody here, I always just want to entertain them, whether that's through scaring them or exciting them or whatever. That's always the main, the goal of telling a story, as opposed to, again, making music or a painting. I want to entertain them through a story. Beyond that, I do put in things I'm thinking about, things I want to talk about, but it's never I've learned over the years to not have that be the intent of the book, if you will. It's something I put in there because it's what's on my mind. I'm going to talk about, that's part of why we convey stories, is we want to express something from within ourselves. But I've learned that you can't control how an audience is going to hear or respond to that, or what they're going to pick up on. So you may you may have somebody come in a room, and maybe it's a woman and she has a green ribbon in her hair, and you put that in there, and it's really just something you thought up as you're doing it and you're going on, and because you're really focused on who's sitting in the chair, because that's what you really want to talk about. And then what you'll end up getting is all these people going, I love your use of the green ribbon. The green ribbon was the whole meaning. And you're like, what green ribbon? I don't even remember putting green ribbon in there. Or in the, in a more, that's I just made up, but in a real cases with the Max Porter Paranormal Mysteries, there's the main form of magic is through witchcraft and witches. And it's all, my use of witchcraft is not based on any historical use of witchcraft, the way they cast spells. It's all just out of my head, based on things I've, an amalgamation of influences through my life, and how we've seen witchcraft portrayed and how I wanted to portray it. And I have gotten numerous emails that start with, I am a Wiccan, and I'm like, uh-oh, what did I do wrong? And then they go on to tell me how, while I'm not being accurate, of course, they love it. And they love how in depth I go into their lives and how this really touched them. And I'm thinking, I did that? What are you talking about? I just threw some mumbo jumbo made up witchcraft, and you're telling me that this touched you as, few novels portray witches. I'm like, so yeah, how I don't try to control that, gauge, control, guide. I put out, this is me on a plate, this is what I put into this story and how I see the world, and you get what you're going to get out of it from your point of view, and hopefully it helps entertain you and it helps move you in some way that keeps you coming back for more. So
can I bounce off what both gentlemen have been saying? The one you said that was a magic thing, that somebody would contact you out of the blue and kind of talk to you about something you've written. And you said that, people come back with things that you've written and get much more out of it than you put in. I wrote a story once for a competition. Well, not for a competition. I wrote the story, but the competition just happened to fit it, so I sent it in, and it got places. It was from a point of view of a blind protagonist, and the thing that really surprised me was that in the wake of that, I got an email from somebody who was complete. I didn't know them from a bar or so. I got an email from this complete stranger who said that, she's read the story and she wanted me to settle a discussion between her and her friend. Was I, in fact, or had I ever been blind? So I got something right. I mean, clearly I was portraying an experience that made at least one of those readers think that it was done from experience.
Mm-hmm. You're just never, again, like with the green ribbon example, you never know what they're going to focus on. I first learned this in high school. Quick little story. We were doing some creative writing project. I wrote the story, handed it in, and the teacher said, "Oh, you didn't put a title on it. Please put a title on it." So I quickly wrote a title. I just threw some words on there. I don't, a day in the life of the character or whatever, right? And turned it in. And like a week later, we all got together, and she had picked my story out. She wanted everybody to read it. So they did. And then they started discussing it, and they spent pretty much the entire time discussing about the depth of the title and how it related to the whole story. and that was like my first, touch of that, of realizing that, I mean, I did write that title, and I do believe that on a subconscious level, we put things into our stories that are there. I mean, if people find them there, they're there, whether we consciously put it there or not. So, part of my brain said, here's the title that's going to connect with the story. But again, it's not something, I think it's something that when we try to control it and say, okay, the green ribbon is going to be a symbol, it usually comes out very heavy-handed. But if we are more just focused on, here's how I'm going to tell this story, the other creative parts of us will, if we allow it to, will flow out.
All right, perfect. So that will do it for the panel. But before we go, let's go around the room one more time so everyone can tell the audience where they can find you on the internet. And we'll start with you, Alma.
I've got a website at almaalexander.org, not com. The com domain got snatched from under me and is currently, as far as I know, the site where some Chinese family is trying to sell cat food. So don't go to the com site. It's almaalexander.org. And I'm in all the usual places. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I've got a Patreon, should anybody care to join us there. I've got a new project starting on there now, so you can get in on the ground floor. But I'm around pretty much everywhere. Just look for me in the usual places. You're going to find traces of me.
All right, perfect. Angela.
I have a Facebook site, Angela Giddings. Right now it's got a weird mask with a spider on it as my profile picture. Also can be contacted through Sick Chick Flicks because I do indie horror filmmaking here in North Carolina with the Sick Chicks, who are awesome bunch of women and men. And I just want to plug the book briefly. This is the cover of the new one. It's a shower of embers. So, and that's on Amazon.
All right. Elmarie.
You can find me at elmariewood.com. You could find me at Facebook at facebook.com/elmariewood. And on Twitter at elmariewood1. I also have an author page at Amazon, and guess what that is? Elmarie Wood.
All right, Stuart.
Well, now I'm going to echo all that, except put in Stuart Jaffe. StuartJaffe.com is my website. I'm on Facebook, and Amazon. Go to Amazon, put in Stuart Jaffe, and you will find all the books.
All right, and finally, Frank.
You can find me at frankwbutterfield.com. If you Google my name, you'll find everything else because I'm the only Frank W. Butterfield in the world, so which is nice. But I'm on Instagram, where you can, if you need to know what Daytona Beach looks like today, go to my Instagram page. You'll find a picture of it. And I'm also on Facebook. So,
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of my guests today and all of you watching. So join us next time. Bye, everyone.
bye.